I'm Jamil Smith, Senior National Correspondent for MTV News. The name of this panel is It Doesn't Have to Be This Way. That's exactly what our panel is here to discuss, namely how we can envision an altogether different prison system, one that is based on human dignity and rehabilitation rather than punishment. Now, each of the individuals here beside me is in their own way dedicated to the pursuit of a more humane justice system. Johnny Perez, whose story we just heard, is a safe reentry advocate for the Urban Justice Center and a campaigner who works with the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Beside him is Daniel Sered. She is founder and director of Common Justice, a remarkable organization that seeks, among many other things, to promote alternatives to incarceration and practical victim-centered solutions to violence. Thank you, Danielle. And last but not least is John Wetzel, who is Secretary of Corrections in the state of Pennsylvania, where he oversees corrections facilities across the state. He is recognized as one of the most innovative thought leaders in this sphere in the entire country, and has presided over the first reduction in prison population in his state in more than 40 years. And we will learn more about that in a moment. Thank you, John, for being here. So we're going to get started with the big term that revolves around this debate, which is mass incarceration. Over the past 5 or so years, that's a term that's been commonly used and understood to mean that the system has grown to become too big and that we simply lock too many people up. Johnny, who are these 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in our prisons and jails?
Yeah, most of the people that are incarcerated, in my experience, they're people who are, I want to say underprivileged a lot of times, people of color, people that look like me, walk like me, talk like me, who are disproportionately affected by a lot of the policies that actually led them to be incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna tell you something, throughout my 13 years in prison, I've been to about 9 different prisons, maximum state prisons, and 2 medium security prisons. And I've met some of the most compassionate, some of the most caring, smart, self-taught individuals, mm-hmm. Who, because of their ignorance, applied criminal solutions to everyday problems.
Mm-hmm. Danielle, you come at your work from a particular vantage point. You have been both a victim of crime and a perpetrator of it. How has that experience informed your work, and what did those experiences teach you?
I think growing up here in Chicago, where I'm born and raised, I grew up as mass incarceration was first developing, right? We talk about it as the era of the crack epidemic, but it was also the moment when mass incarceration was on its rise. Mm-hmm. And I remember the impact it had of people going away, families losing family members, the difficulty of people returning, having experienced what they did. And I remember thinking that it was devastating for those people, it was devastating for their families, but surely it must be useful to the victims of their crimes. And then I started to reflect on my own experience as a survivor of violence and the experiences of people around me, to listen to other survivors. And it turned out that actually the majority of us didn't want the people who hurt us incarcerated, not because we were merciful and compassionate and forgiving. Many of us were furious. We wanted blood, we were full of rage, but we were what most survivors are, which is practical. We wanted a solution that would keep us safe and keep others safe. And we already knew, even in those early days of mass incarceration, that prison wouldn't be that solution. Right. And so what I learned as being somebody who's been on both sides, which most of us are, whether it's criminal or not, we've hurt people and we've been hurt, is that what we all need is real accountability. Not punishment, but real accountability. Mm-hmm. And what we all need is interventions that actually produce safety.
Well, and on that note, what does accountability look like? I mean, in what ways? There's a lot of talk in Washington, in mm-hmm. local communities, about being tough on crime. Mm-hmm. That sort of renewed talk is coming back with this administration. What does accountability look like now?
I mean, with all respect to my esteemed colleague, I think that there are a few places.
I'm in trouble.
You're like, it happened so fast. There are a few places that are softer on crime in terms of accountability than prison. And what I mean by that is that the thing we owe when we have hurt someone, I believe, is to face the human impact of what we've done. We have no right to escape that reckoning. And when people are incarcerated, we excuse them from that reckoning, while at the same time inflicting extraordinary pain and isolation and degradation, the very things that we know are drivers of violence. And so accountability means acknowledging what you've done, acknowledging the impact it has had on others, making those things as right as you possibly can, and never doing those things ever again. Doing that requires dignity, it requires agency, it requires power, and in many ways it requires freedom, which means for many, in many contexts, punishment and accountability, it's not just that they're not the same, it's that they're actually incompatible.
Now, John, I want to ask you to respond to that question of accountability as well, but first, I want to ask you really about how you've managed to decrease the prison population in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's fallen, incredibly. How has that happened, and maybe how is accountability tied into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really starts with the place that we overuse incarceration as a response to crime. And I believe some people need to be incarcerated, some for a very long time. But we've clearly overused incarceration. And I think for me, it really starts with this just simple premise. We call it a correction system.
Right.
So what that means is that when someone comes in the front end of the system, when they leave the back end, they should be less likely to commit a crime. Implicit in that is that, first of all, the punishment meets the crime itself. As far as, if this is the damage, then this is the response. And we've gone way overboard with that.
Right.
But beyond that, then, we have a responsibility to create an environment inside facilities when folks come in that we're not screwing people up.
Yeah.
And what we've really done is we've shifted the conversation around outcomes. The reality is this year we're going to release 18 to 20,000 people from prisons all across Pennsylvania. There's not one county in Pennsylvania that we're not going to release somebody back to. And the simple question I ask people is, how do you want people to come out of your facilities? Because guess what? They're coming. They're going to interact with you. They're going to interact with your family member. And the reality is we're all invested in corrections' ability to create an environment where someone can be corrected.
Right.
And so that's really where we started. And I think the second thing is we really just tried to focus on identifying the root cause of crime. If the root cause of crime is addiction, and we lock someone up and we don't address the addiction, we've wasted a bunch of money, wasted a bunch of time. We have an addict coming out the back end who's going to use again and commit another crime.
Right.
That defies a lot. You don't get a return on the human investment, and you don't get a return on your dollar. So I think that's really how we've shifted the focus.
Now, of course, you've seen in other states, say Massachusetts, have seen some programs that dealing with the opioid epidemic, where they're not necessarily trying to put people in prison, they're trying to make sure people get treatment. But a lot of, cynics, I guess you say cynics or critics, have wondered if that's because now all of a sudden the face of the drug problem is white. I want to ask you all, starting with Johnny, about the racial disparities that we're confronting here, and how that ties into any effort to reimagine what prison should be. No,
you're absolutely right. Look, when I think about a diversion program, the United States have had a diversion program for years. It's called white skin. And when I think about the crack epidemic and I think about this new opioid epidemic, it's really clear that it's been, not only did it feed mass incarceration as a whole, but also there's huge disparities there. In addition to that, we're in a place where we've criminalized drug addiction, we've criminalized mental illness, we've even criminalized homelessness in a lot of states. And the question is when we call the cops arrest. If someone is having an emotional disturbance, we don't call an ambulance or a doctor. And of course, along with those racial disparities, comes everything else with it. The financial disparities. People can't even make bail. You take a place like Rikers Island, where 85% of the people have not been convicted of a crime, right? But most of the people there have under a $10,000 bail.
Right.
Yeah.
You look at the case of Khalif Browder. The young man who was locked up for allegedly stealing a backpack. Danielle, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, when I committed crimes in this city as a teenager, I was met with mercy, right? Like a judge looked at me and saw me as a child and saw me as a person that with the right intervention, with the right guidance, with a little bit of time, would go on to do something of use in my life, something of meaning. There was something when he looked at me as a small white girl, because I was white then too, he saw... Right? He saw someone who could have been his daughter. He saw someone where he thought that interrupting this person's life would be a loss, that taking this person from her family would be a loss, that it was something that might make it harder for him to sleep at night. When he looked at my black male co-defendant, who I know full well of the two of us had a better moral compass than I did at the time, he saw somebody he was afraid of. He saw somebody who he thought might hurt his daughter, might bring her down a criminal path, and he made very different decisions for both of us. And so I first came to understand the racial disparities in the criminal justice system as their beneficiary. And that meant two things. It meant, one, I believe I incurred a lifelong obligation to go to war with those disparities until I defeated them in movement. But I also learned that that system is capable of acting humanely when it chooses to. He didn't need legislative reform. He didn't need new directives. He had every tool within his toolbox that he needed to do what exactly Johnny said, to activate the oldest alternative to incarceration in America, which is whiteness. And so however much we need to change laws and policies, we know as white folks who are diverted, who are sent, when we hear the word detention, we think it means staying late after school as opposed to juvenile detention facilities, which are youth jails, right? We have been diverted over and over. And so what we can do is testify to the fact that every single system, the police, the schools, the courts, the prisons, have within their power the tools to act humanely when they choose to. And we can be certain of that because they did that for us. And then we can call on those systems to do for everyone what they do for us.
I mean, I feel like sometimes prisons are designed to keep people from, being held accountable. And then they're released into the world, and then they're looked at, most of them have brown or black skin, and then they're judged to be inherently unaccountable. I mean, how much do you feel like that correlation works, John? And how do you incorporate this obvious racial disparity into what you're trying to do with the prisons in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, certainly any real conversation about criminal justice policy, race is always the elephant in the room, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a couple other elephants in the room. Poor people, mentally ill people, addicted people. Mm-hmm. But I think the point my colleague here made is a great point, and it really starts with recognizing the defendant or the inmate's humanity. Mm. And I think where we've come up short as a society, and we're all complicit in this, right? I mean, the mechanism we got here is by electing people who use public safety as a Trojan horse to mean lock more people up, okay? So we're all complicit in this. And what we have to realize is that we have to value an individual's humanity and believe in man's capacity to change. Man, not man. My daughter, I got
Humankind.
4 daughters. They're probably yelling at me right now.
Humankind.
But when you speak about the opioid epidemic in particular, and certainly everyone has reason to look at our system with cynicism, right? And everybody that would be an appropriate point of reference. But who cares why people are now saying that we can't lock up people and get out of this? Mm-hmm. Who cares? I agree with that. I agree that the people who are addicted to opioids, we can do far better by not locking them up, by putting them in appropriate treatment. Mm-hmm. If there was some criminal behavior, find some mechanism for accountability, but address that root cause. I also believe that we should do that for everyone who's locked up in my system right now. Huh. And I think that if we're smart, that we can build on this momentum and understand that for the first time ever, it's not us and them, because us is them. Mm-hmm. And that's what this opioid epidemic, to me, really gives us the opportunity. And shame on us if we don't use this opportunity to move forward. And I know, I was watching, I don't know why I was watching the news stations before I came here, but what's going on what's going on in
Oh,
Harrisburg.
the press.
Anyhow, what's going on in D.C. and everybody's wringing their hands. But understand this, that Congress has moved significantly around reform, and Congress hasn't changed, right? And Congress is us, we the people. And if we the people, I mean, we're sitting in a high school right now having this conversation. That's progress. That wouldn't have happened even 3 or 4 years ago. We wouldn't be sitting here with a panel comprised like this. Right. So we have a real opportunity in informing and challenging and asking questions and trying to just keep focusing on what's the path to get this individual that did ABC to not do ABC again, and beyond that, to go be a productive citizen.
Well, in that respect, can you tell us about some of the programs that you've implemented in your prisons and have helped people not only become accountable, but also become more productive?
Yeah, we've really focused on those kind of 3 specific areas. What you have to know about my population is 50% of everybody comes through our front door doesn't have a high school diploma. So for me, and I'll tell you another number, a young black person in Pennsylvania who drops out of school has a 70% lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated. So for me, it starts with, you want to start corrections reform? Let's have a real school system that educates people, that gives people... that gives people the opportunity to be who they can be regardless of the zip code they grew up in. And so one of the big things that we champion is early childhood education, quality pre-K, nurse-family partnership. Let's start there. And in some ways, if we can just keep a kid in school, we make progress. The second thing you need to know is over 70% are addicted, suffer from a substance use disorder. So we really measured outcomes of our drug and alcohol programs and changed it, and then focused on that reentry on the back end. For the opioid epidemic, we've doubled the number of opioid addicted individuals who come through our front door from 6% to 12%. They now can get Vivitrol, medication-assisted treatment, on their way out, followed up by shots while they're in the community to try to remove those cravings and remove that barrier. Probably the most challenging group we've had to deal with is mentally ill individuals. You're looking at the person who, 28% of my population, 28% of 50,000 people are on our mental health roster. I'm responsible for the delivery of mental health services to more individuals than anybody else in the state of Pennsylvania. How is that okay? I mean, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So again, we spent a lot of time focusing on partnering with our Secretary of the Department of Human Services to try to inform people that we have to have a real behavioral health safety net so individuals can get treated in the community. At the same time, we did a terrible job with mentally ill individuals. We overused solitary confinement for them. The result of that was that they were injuring themselves and they were coming out worse. So we actually got sued a couple times, which certainly helped. I wouldn't recommend it as a way to get it, but you got to do what you got to do. Nice. And we've really focused on the conditions of confinement for mentally ill individuals, and we also focused on training the correctional staff on how to manage individuals with mental illness. And that's a group that often gets demonized, but I got to tell you, I got a 10% rule. If there's 10 people in a room, one of them's an idiot. Right? That translates to all different fields. And so I got 15,000 staff, right? Right. And 50,000 inmates, and I think it works the same for both groups. And so we focus. A lot
of idiots, John.
You should go to DC. I'm sorry. I watched the news, remember?
Nice.
But we really focused on, and the correctional staff said to me, you don't give me the tools to deal with this population. Right. So we really focused on training them on how to do that. And as a result of that, we got more humane. We're not there yet, but it all starts with being humane and acknowledging an individual's humanity.
And Johnny, I know you participated in some restorative justice programs when you were incarcerated.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that did for you and how maybe it altered your perspective?
Yeah, so you have a lot of time to think in prison. And I started to ask myself a lot of questions. I started to ask myself, why did I think it was okay to grab a gun and go inside of a grocery store? Why did I think it was okay to handle my problems with criminal solutions? Why do I resort to violence? Why is it that my self-esteem is directly connected to the amount of money I have in my pocket? And then I started to take college. You know, I was fortunate enough to land in a prison that had a college program, which, you know, if I can just pinpoint one thing that would really serve as a catalyst for me to move in a direction of where I don't want to ever commit a crime again, it was definitely education. Right. Coming from a school system that I went from the 8th grade to the 10th grade, getting passed all along, and then you go to Rikers Island and find out, oh, I didn't know I had an 8th grade reading level, right? So I was really in a space where I was really exploring and trying to find solutions and really understand myself, right? And here it is, I was granted the opportunity to sit down with someone who had been the victim of a robbery, and here I was, a person who committed a robbery, and I was scared, to tell you the truth. And not a lot of things scared me, but this, I was like, I don't know what to expect, you know, right. And on both sides. And I sat across this woman. She was an older white woman. And she told me what happened to her, you know, which, you know, I'll keep that between her and I, you know, and, you know, I remember thinking that this could be my mother, you know? And that for me, like, really personalized it so much so that I was able to see my actions through the lenses, through the eyes of another person. And for, I think, the first time in my life, I felt like shit, you know? And, you know, I said, like, this is not who I want to be, you know? It's like one day you look in the mirror, you're like, who is this person? You know, and that definitely moved me a whole lot along in my transformation and in my process of change.
Daniel, I see you nodding your head. What thoughts do you have about, you know, programs that are already in place in prison, and also programs maybe that people have been pushing to put in prisons that would help but are meeting resistance?
So I think those are incredibly important. I think opportunities like the one you describe are transformative, and I think they are even more transformative for people who are free. So at Common Justice, we divert people from prison who have committed serious violence into a process somewhat like the one Johnny describes, right? People with the consent of the victims of their crimes, people who have robbed and assaulted people badly, done things that none of us have any right to do to anyone, go through an intensive preparatory process, have a dialogue with the people they hurt where they reach agreements about how they can make things as right as possible. And those include things you'd expect, like go to school, do community service, get a job, apologize, pay restitution, but also things you might not expect, like the harmed and responsible party, we don't say victim and offender, meeting each other's children. So this man saying, you know, I want you to meet the children whose father you almost took from them that night with your gun. And I believe today in the father you can be to your baby girl, and I want to say that to her face. Harmed and responsible party doing a speaking tour in their neighborhood about the impact of cycles of violence on their life. One case where the person who robbed someone taught that same person self-defense techniques, right, in a way that transformed his experience of trauma. And so we talk not just about feeling sorry or saying sorry, but about doing sorry, right? What does remorse look like? What does accountability look like? Not as a set of feelings, but as a set of actions. And that's the hardest thing for someone who's incarcerated to do, because the actions you can take in prison are limited. And we believe when people hurt people, they incur an obligation. Each of us who commits harm owes something for it. And so it is free people who are best positioned to pay that debt. And so we've had fewer than 8% of the people in our program terminated for new crimes while they're with us. I imagine that is an enviable figure to a corrections system. And
That's two.
I know, what happens at 3? I told you, I'm in my hometown, I'm feeling brave. But so that we see that not because we're some miraculous intervention, unlike anything anyone else can do, but because accountability works, because facing the human impact of what we've done calls on the hardest places in us and the best in us, and those are the things that will drive us to be people who do not hurt people ever again. And in the meantime, that exact same process delivers healing and transformation to the people who are hurt. And I would be hard-pressed to find anyone who could say that people who have survived things like assault and robbery do not deserve the intervention that is most likely to deliver them from their pain.
Let's pivot to some other radical solutions that have been presented. Now, we saw in the video what Germany is doing. Some stats, there's no life without parole. It's unconstitutional. No background checks after release. So the public records about a person's criminal history are just unavailable. You can't, the public can't access them. And there's no maximum security prisons. So John, I know you went over to Europe with the Vera Institute to learn about the systems in places like Germany. I know that we have some photos of the kinds of facilities that you saw on the visit. What were the biggest differences that you saw? Were they in the bricks and the mortar, or was it the physical environment, or was it more sort of ethereal, psychological, fundamental differences?
Yeah, it was like night and day. It would be difficult, even, I spent my entire career, this is what I've done, since 1989 when I started as a correctional officer at age 20. I like to tell people I've never had a real job in my life. But I got to tell you that going through the prisons in Germany and the Netherlands, it was transformative. It really, it doesn't look anything, the physical plant looks the same. They got walls and wire and cells, but a couple things really stuck out. Number one, just a lack of density of people. So we went to a youth prison, and I have a prison for younger individuals who are incarcerated, and it was the exact same square footage inside the fence as ours. Talking to the inmates, they were the same, you know what I'm talking about, those same 16 to 25-year-olds who, not shy, very inquisitive, and that's some nice ways to say, just a challenging kind of group. And exact same conversations with them. They had 300 in theirs, we have 12 or 1,300 inside the same square footage. Wow. And that was consistent. So the number one thing is just the sheer density. And even in this era of reform, and we're as guilty as anybody, when you reform, when the population reduces, there's such a drive to save money that you close prisons, right? So we're making progress in population, not making as much progress in the density or the capacity. And frankly, it's been a criticism I've gotten in closing prisons. But that's a fundamental difference, and that really speaks to the environment. The second thing is this principle of normalcy. So it's part of their constitution that the life in prison has to be as normal as it possibly can be. It needs to mimic the community as much as it possibly can, and only a legitimate penological interest can interfere with that. And they define it not like we do, right? And that was significant. And then every decision in that system is based on what's best for that individual and what's going to make them less likely to commit a crime. It was really amazing. And probably the coolest moment for me, when I heard German prison, that's not what I was thinking. I'm just telling you.
Yeah.
And, I really was skeptical that it was going to have any impact at all. But it was a free trip to Europe. To tour prisons, which I love to do, by the way, so who wouldn't do that?
Might as well, right?
Right. And so after we toured the prisons in Germany, I was talking to the minister who was over that state's justice system. And I said, I don't get this. This is not what I was thinking. And she said, when you lock up and execute your own people, this notion of freedom means something. And what I really heard there is similar to the opioid epidemic, where again, it used to be them. And whoever them is, them's always in trouble. We are always okay, them's always in trouble. And they just realized that we're all in this together, and that this notion of freedom is precious. And to me, it really struck me, and frankly bothered me, that here we are, the land of the free. But I just wonder, as a society, and again, I think we're all complicit in this. Where do we value freedom? And if we truly value freedom, would our system look like it does today?
Right. This question of freedom is also a question of dignity. And I want to ask the two of you, starting with Johnny. Would we feel the same way about prisons in this country if we actually encouraged human dignity and rehabilitation, made those the core values? Johnny, what do you think about that?
Yeah, let me tell you, in prison, you're constantly having this like psychological battle where like you're constantly dehumanized in a lot of different ways. Not only some of the ways that I mentioned earlier during the intake, but even in the language. You know, no one ever called me by my first name until I was actually released. No one ever said Johnny to me. You know, and now, you know, I work as a reentry advocate, helping people transition back into society. Some of which are being released directly from solitary, some of which are being released without medications. You know, I had a client who was released in 20-degree weather without a coat. Right? And then he went and stole a coat, and guess what happened? He got arrested.
Right.
And you know what we say? Oh, he had a second chance, he blew it.
Right.
You know, if we see people as people, then we'll treat people as people, period. You know, and one of the ways that, you know, we dehumanize folks in prison is actually by the language that we use, you know. It makes us feel better. We say inmate, we say convict, we say ex-con, we say jailbird. You know, and what you're doing with that language is that you're reducing that person to just one part of their life, and we're multifaceted. Like I said, I'm also a father, a student, a mentor, a facilitator, you know, an advocate, you know, and you know, when we see people as people, we treat them as such, and our policies, rules, regulations, and even the systems that affect these people need to reflect that.
Yeah.
You know.
Daniel, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think when the thing about a value is that you only get to say you're someone who holds it if you always hold it, right? Like it's easy to say I never steal unless I really want a thing, right? Like I never lie unless I'm busted, right? Like I never commit violence unless I'm angry, right? To say we hold a value, we have to hold it all the time. So if we are people who don't believe in violence, we have to not believe in violence even in prison. We have to not believe in violence even against people who have committed harm, right? Like we have to hold those values with a constancy that we don't as a culture. And that is not by any means just about people who are in prison or work in prison. All of us co-sign that. Right. All of us talk about it all the time. Like there are jokes. If you like watch enough primetime television, you won't make it through a week without a joke about prison rape. Like everyone's like, people tell jokes about like, don't drop the soap, like that's funny, right? Like we laugh about it as a people. If we want to be people who say violence is wrong and it matters, then we have to say violence is wrong and it matters every single time. And we have to build prisons that uphold that principle always, and we have to build communities that uphold that principle always. And what that forces us to do is to reckon with the things that cause violence in the first place, and to make those things our unequivocal enemies, right? To say that when we understand the core drivers of violence on an individual level are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs, and we know the main features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. It means we have baked into our violence intervention strategy the core drivers of violence, right? It's like trying to put out a house fire by throwing a Molotov cocktail through the front door. It is not what you do if you are trying to quell the flames. And so if we are going to be a values-based people, it means we have to find the courage and the integrity to be values-based all the time.
To that end, Danielle, you released a report this week about ways of dealing with violence. Mm-hmm. In what fundamental ways do we mishandle violence in America? And can you talk about some of the conclusions that you made in that report?
Sure. So the first thing is we talk about violence as a problem of dangerous people, as opposed to something that is produced by a set of conditions. That in no way eliminates the reality of individual responsibility. We are each responsible for what we do, no matter what the constraints are on our behavior. But at the same time, we know that poverty drives violence. We know inequity drives violence. We know that substandard education drives violence. We know that limited healthcare, limited access to mental health care, all of those things drive violence. And historically, we have divested from the things that would reduce those drivers, primarily in communities of color. So in certain communities, we have made a structural investment in violence. And then we have told a story about the people who live in those communities as though there is something innately in them that makes them more likely to hurt others. And then we start to say things like black on black crime. It's not just that virtually all crime is intraracial, meaning most white folks hurt white folks, most black folks hurt black folks. We start in our families and work our way out. Very few people commit violence against anyone who lives more than a mile from them. And so, like, violence is an intimate thing in community. But also, we fail to see the ways that these structures make violence nearly inevitable in communities, and so we don't take responsibility for it. The other mistake we make is that we think that the interests of the people who commit harm and the interests of the people who are harmed are fundamentally opposed. And so I said earlier that people who commit violence only get into common justice if the victims of their crimes agree. So you're talking only half of victims call the police in the first place. If we were serious about violence, we would regard that as a moral crisis, that half of people who are beaten, who are assaulted, who are knocked unconscious prefer nothing to everything we have on offer in our system. We have no right to talk about ourselves as a victim-centered criminal justice system when that's true. Another half of those don't even make it to grand jury. And so because they drop out of the process early on, they don't think it will meet their needs. So of those remaining portion, we say to those people, do you want the people who robbed you, who stabbed you, who hurt you, to go to prison or to go to common justice? And 90% choose common justice. 90%. It's a wild number. It is not mostly because they are compassionate and merciful and forgiving, though we see some of that. It is because they want something that they believe will keep them and others safe. And so they put aside their rage in the interest of their safety. They put aside their fury in the interest of safety of other people in their communities. And they make a practical choice. So one of the things we have to do when we come to terms with violence is to let go of the mythology we have about victims as being irrational, vengeful white women. A young man of color is 10 times more likely than me to be robbed or assaulted. And I know as a survivor that far more than we are ever depicted, we are fiercely pragmatic people because our survival depends on the responses to the harm we survive working. So we don't get to do punishment for punishment's sake or be philosophical. Maybe if we lived in a nice gated community and we're mostly concerned about our poll numbers and not our safety in the streets, we could do those things. But when we are concerned about our safety in the streets, we have to choose what works. And at the end of the day, prison isn't what works.
Johnny, I just want to get your thoughts on misconceptions of violence, and especially, given your crime, through your experience, not only in prison, but also helping people as they get out. I mean, how did they understand, violence when they're getting out? How did you understand violence?
Yeah, it always felt forced in a way. I think that I've, not only through my own experience of, prison, but even in my own life, the times when I've been violent have been in times where I felt forced to be violent, including in prison. And I learned very early on. I was standing there in front of the desk of correctional officers assigning me my bed. Clinton Correctional Facility. This guy comes behind me, runs up to the desk, and says, "CO, they're robbing me. They're taking everything in my cell." And 23 years old, I was probably weighing about 120 pounds, no mustache, and the CO says, "Get away from my desk and get a knife like everybody else." And that's when I realized two things. One, I better get a knife, right? Two, I can die in here. Right. And it's better to be prey than to be preyed on. So now I'm more likely to attack you if I even think you're going to do something to me, because that environment kind of creates that. Right. So I always ask myself, at what point did I turn the switch off? The first time that I saw somebody get cut, I was like shocked, like, oh my God, this just happened. Years later, if someone was get cut, he got cut, he'll be all right. And at what point did that desensitize me to violence, where I felt that it was nothing, and a lot of my clients feel like that. Yeah. And I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but I know that I will tell you that the prison, the policies, and the way that it's created, and even structurally, increases the likelihood that a person will respond aggressively and therefore with violence.
There's one, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to ask one question of everybody, and I'll start with you, John. And we can, approach this from whatever angle that you want. We hear a lot about our president specifically calling out Chicago for its crime, specifically calling out, well, no, it's pretty much just Chicago. What do you think about that? What do you think about how he thinks about criminal justice and the message that he is sending, not just to people who have committed crimes, but also to communities throughout this country about what they should fear?
Yeah, I think it's an example of rhetoric. I don't think he's spent a whole lot of time thinking about crime. I think we have the opportunity, I hope we start thinking about crime in the context of what real solutions for it. Not acknowledging that crime is not where it begins. It begins with the education system and economic opportunities, and it really begins there. I mean, you look at any system, from the behavioral health system to the education system to economic opportunities. Anybody falls through a crack in any one of those systems, the end of that chasm is a prison, period. So if we want to reduce our use of prisons, we got to fill those crevices. And it really starts there. And I hope it really has to be acknowledged that that's where it starts. There's evil people in these communities. There's people who have no other option or very little other options.
Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, as someone from Chicago, I know that, like, as a city, we don't take kindly to other people saying they're going to come in here and do anything at all. But what I know is, like, so when everyone says our murder rates here are the highest they've been for 20, 25 years, they're referring back to the time I came of age here. And so this is a city where I've buried people I love to violence, like where I come to town and visit graves of people who died as children. And so I don't think about the violence in this town as an opportunity for rhetoric or popularity or being tough on crime. Like, I understand that as somebody who is still mourning what it means, and where witnessing that violence grow day after day is both new and old pain at the same time. And what's true is that when we last saw this level of violence in this city, we chose as a nation mass incarceration as the way out of it. And I understand that. I mean, I came home one day and there was a decapitated head in front of my house. I understand my neighbors saying, lock anybody up in response to that, right? Like, I'm not mad at it, I get it, but we know better now. Because we chose that. The day I was born in this town, there were 443,850 people locked up in America. There are 2.3 million today. Like, we did this in our lifetime. We made this choice. Millions of people have paid with their freedom, with their lives, with their safety as a result of that choice. And so in this moment where we are seeing those conditions arise again, we have an opportunity, and I believe an obligation down to, like, the marrow of our bones, to make a different choice, like to make a choice that will actually steer us out of violence in a way that is not temporary, that isn't momentary, but that will last for generations, so that I don't have to be back up here 25 years from now telling the same story again.
But Johnny, just to close this out,
yeah,
I just want to ask you, how is this administration going to exacerbate that problem, do you feel?
I think that a lot of times we place the burden of responsibility on the individual, and we ignore the systems that actually increase or even affect the individual. Like the example with the guy with the coat. Not only do they need to have people who are directly affected by the issue a part of these conversations, definitely, but also, not only just hold individuals accountable, but also this collective accountability where we have to hold ourselves accountable as a system, as a criminal justice system, as an administration. What can we do better as opposed to trying to demonize an entire group of people? When I think about the neighborhood that I grew up at, in New York, there's 24-hour porn shops, as if people from low-income neighborhoods have gold laying around a porn at 3 o'clock in the morning. The price of liquor costs less than a gallon of milk. Right. And I've met plenty of young black men who think about not if I'm going to run into the cops, but when I run into the cops. I know people who don't wear hoodies or wear Timberland boots just because of that.
Yeah.
You know, and I always ask myself, at what point do we create an environment where people have to make these kind of decisions? And I don't want to see that perpetuated under by Donald Trump presidency. And I'll stop with that.
And we'll stop with that. Thank you to this panel.
Thank you.